The sun hung low in the late afternoon sky, casting long shadows across the crowded intersection. The air shimmered with heat, rising from the asphalt like a mirage, while the rhythmic drone of car engines formed a constant background hum. Amid the chaos of honking horns and the occasional frustrated shout of a driver, General Victor Kane sat in his SUV, calm and collected, a stark contrast to the world around him. The SUV itself was a simple, sturdy vehicle, its once polished exterior now dulled by years of service. Kane liked it that way, unassuming, practical, and utterly reliable. He took a sip from his thermos, enjoying the familiar taste of coffee that was just bitter enough to remind him of long nights in command posts and early mornings before the first light of dawn. His sunglasses shielded his eyes from the glare, but they also obscured the keen, calculating gaze of a man who had spent decades assessing threats, reading people, and making decisions that others couldn't begin to fathom. Traffic had slowed to a crawl, a tangle of cars and motorcycles vying for position as everyone tried to inch forward. The light ahead remained stubbornly red, as though mocking the collective impatience of the drivers below. Kane's grip on the wheel was steady, his knuckles neither white with tension nor relaxed with disinterest. He wasn't in a hurry. He had learned long ago that patience often paid off in situations far more critical than a city traffic jam. The motorcycles arrived with a roar, cutting through the monotony of the scene like a knife. 5 of them, sleek and aggressive, their riders clad in leather jackets adorned with patches and insignias that screamed rebellion and bravado. Their engines growled as they wove through the gaps between cars, the sound reverberating off nearby buildings. Kane noticed them immediately. It wasn't the noise that caught his attention. It was the movement, the calculated disorder that suggested a group used to taking what they wanted without consequence. One of the bikers, a wiry young man with a shaved head and a sneer that seemed permanently etched onto his face, spotted Kane's SUV. He nudged the rider next to him, a burly figure with a beard that seemed to spill over the edge of his helmet, and pointed toward the vehicle. They laughed, the kind of laughter that was meant to intimidate rather than amuse. Kane didn't react, his face a mask of indifference as he continued to sip his coffee. The bikers circled his vehicle like sharks scenting blood, their engines revving in unison. It was a performance designed to draw attention, to provoke. One of them leaned in close, his handlebars almost brushing the side mirror of Kane's SUV. The general's hands remained on the wheel, his body unmoving, but his eyes tracked their every motion through the mirrors. He wasn't just watching, he was assessing, cataloging details that might matter later. The way the leader carried himself, the distribution of weight on his bike, the way his hands gripped the handlebars, all of it told a story. A loud bang echoed through the air as one of the bikers slapped the hood of Kane's SUV with his hand, leaving a faint smudge on the dusty surface. A few nearby drivers turned their heads, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and caution. The bikers thrived on that attention, their bravado fueled by the silent audience around them. The leader, a man with mirrored sunglasses that reflected the world back at itself, pulled his bike directly in front of Kane's SUV, blocking his path. He grinned, a toothy smile that didn't reach his eyes, and raised his hand in a mock salute. Kane placed the thermos back into its holder with deliberate care. His movements were unhurried, almost leisurely, but there was an undercurrent of precision to everything he did. He lowered the driver's side window slightly, enough to let his voice carry, but not enough to invite further intrusion. His tone was even, devoid of the anger or fear they might have expected. "Move along," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. The leader's grin faltered for a fraction of a second before he laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "What's the matter, old man? Can't take a little joke?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Kane didn't respond. He didn't need to. His silence spoke volumes, a quiet defiance that unnerved the bikers more than any shouted threat could have. The leader, perhaps sensing the need to up the ante, reached out with a gloved hand and dragged his fingers across the side of Kane's SUV, leaving a faint scratch in the paint. It was a deliberate act, a declaration of control. The light ahead turned green, but the vehicles around them remained stationary, their drivers unwilling to get involved in whatever was about to unfold. The city, usually a cacophony of overlapping noises, seemed to hold its breath. Kane's hand shifted to the gear lever, his fingers brushing the worn leather, but he didn't move the vehicle forward. He could feel the weight of the moment settling over him, heavy and familiar. He opened the door and stepped out, unfolding himself in the driver's seat with a grace that belied his years. The bikers, perhaps expecting hesitation or bluster, were momentarily taken aback by the quiet confidence of his movements. Kane adjusted his sunglasses, the slight tilt of his head catching the sun and casting a sharp shadow across his face. He closed the door behind him with a decisive thud, the sound echoing in the charged silence. The bikers watched him, their bravado flickering like a candle in the wind. Kane didn't speak immediately. He let the moment stretch, the weight of his presence filling the space between them. His gaze swept over the group, pausing briefly on each member as though he were sizing them up, which in truth he was. It wasn't fear that gripped the bikers. It was uncertainty. They had miscalculated, and in that brief pause, some part of them realized it. The leader, determined to reclaim control of the situation, dismounted his bike and took a step toward Kane. The grin was back, but it was strained now, forced. "You think you're tough, huh?" he said, his voice loud enough to carry to the onlookers who had gathered at a safe distance. "Let's see what you've got, old man." Kane tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. For the first time he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You've had your fun. Now it's time to leave." The leader laughed again, but this time it was hollow, a brittle sound that betrayed the first cracks in his confidence. Kane didn't wait for a response. He stepped forward, his movements fluid and purposeful, and the bikers instinctively tensed. The city seemed to hold its breath again, the tension thick enough to cut. Kane had been here before, though never quite like this. It wasn't a battlefield, but it didn't need to be. Some lessons were universal, and today he was prepared to teach one. The heat continued to hang heavy in the air, amplifying the tension as the bikers encircled Kane's SUV. Their laughter cut through the ambient noise of traffic, sharp and mocking, as they reveled in their own audacity. Engines roared with sudden bursts of throttle, their sound bouncing off nearby buildings like a challenge. Each rev was a statement, a way of announcing their dominance, their ownership of this moment. Kane remained inside his vehicle, his calm demeanor unshaken, his eyes tracking them through the mirrors. One of the bikers, a wiry figure with tattoos snaking up his neck, leaned in close to Kane's window, peering inside. His breath fogged the glass as he grinned, his teeth yellowed from years of neglect and bad habits. With exaggerated motions, he tapped on the window, his rings clinking against the glass. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" he jeered, his voice muffled but loud enough to be heard. "Cat got your tongue." The others laughed, their laughter high-pitched and full of malice. Another biker, this one younger and seemingly eager to impress the leader, rode up alongside Kane's SUV. His bike screeched to a halt just inches from the passenger door, leaving a faint mark on the ground where his tires had dragged. He leaned over, his helmet visor lifted, and spit onto the side of the SUV, the liquid trailing down in a slow, deliberate line. The group erupted into cheers at the audacity of the act, the sound carrying across the still traffic. Kane didn't flinch. His hand rested lightly on the steering wheel, unmoving, while his gaze remained locked on the scene around him. The leader of the group, the one they called Reaper, watched from his position at the front of the SUV, a crooked smile spreading across his face. He raised his hand, signaling for the others to intensify their antics. The group responded eagerly. One biker pulled out a small knife, its blade glinting in the sun, and began dragging it lightly across the paint of the SUV's hood, leaving a thin scratch. Another slapped the side mirror, sending it vibrating on its hinge. The noise of their actions, coupled with the revving of engines, began to draw the attention of other drivers. Faces peered out from car windows, some curious, others clearly anxious to avoid becoming involved. Kane, ever observant, noted the shift in the crowd's behavior. He could feel the collective unease growing among the bystanders. Some drivers began to pull their cars a few feet back, as though creating a buffer between themselves and the scene unfolding in front of them. Phones were raised, their cameras capturing the escalating chaos, though none of the onlookers seemed brave enough to step in. It was exactly what the bikers wanted, a stage and an audience for their show. Reaper dismounted his bike with a deliberate swagger, his boots clanging against the pavement. He took his time approaching Kane's SUV, his body language oozing confidence. Reaching the driver's side, he leaned his forearm on the roof, peering down into the half-open window. The smirk on his face grew wider as he rapped his knuckles against the glass. "You're not going anywhere, old man," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Not until you show some respect." The other bikers roared in approval, their laughter echoing in the hot, stagnant air. Inside the SUV, Kane's fingers tightened briefly around the steering wheel. It wasn't anger that spurred the motion, but a calculation, a preparation for what might come next. His breathing remained steady, his expression impassive. He reached for his thermos and took one last sip of coffee, savoring the taste as though it might be the last peaceful moment he'd have for a while. Gently, he placed the thermos back into the cup holder, the sound of it clicking into place oddly loud amidst the surrounding chaos. The sound of something striking metal drew Kane's attention to the rear of his vehicle. Another biker had taken out a chain, its links rattling as he swung it against the bumper, leaving faint scuff marks. The display wasn't meant to damage, but to intimidate, a theatrical act meant to assert dominance. The biker laughed as he twirled the chain around his gloved hand, gesturing for the others to join in the fun. One of them responded by revving his engine and lurching his bike forward, stopping just short of the SUV's rear bumper. Kane's eyes flicked to the rear-view mirror, taking in the scene without a word. Reaper tapped the roof of the SUV again, harder this time, his smirk turning into a sneer. "You deaf, old man," he taunted, leaning down so his face was level with the window. "Or maybe you're just scared. That it? You scared of a little scratch on your ride." Kane finally moved, his hand shifting to lower the window a fraction more. The movement was slow, deliberate, and unhurried, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the bikers. When he spoke, his voice was calm, steady, and low, cutting through the din like a blade. "Leave," he said simply, the single word carrying a weight that seemed to settle heavily over the scene. The laughter died down, replaced by a momentary silence. The bikers exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. It was a kind of tone they weren't used to hearing, one that didn't match their expectations of fear or anger. Reaper was the first to recover, his bravado returning as he laughed loudly, clapping his hands together. "Oh, you've got some guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice dripping with mock sympathy. "But guts don't mean much out here, old man." With a swift motion, Reaper reached down and grabbed Kane's side mirror, twisting it slightly out of place. The metallic screech of the adjustment cut through the air, drawing gasps from a few onlookers. Kane didn't react, his eyes hidden behind his sunglasses, but his grip on the door handle tightened ever so slightly. The moment stretched, the heat of the afternoon amplifying the tension that now hung like a storm cloud over the intersection. One of the bikers, emboldened by Reaper's actions, kicked at the rear bumper, his boot leaving a faint dent. Another leaned forward and slapped the hood with the flat of his hand, the sound loud and jarring. The others cheered, their voices blending into a cacophony of noise. Kane's SUV, once a symbol of quiet reliability, had become a focal point for their reckless amusement. Inside the vehicle, Kane took a slow, deep breath. His gaze shifted, tracking each biker with precision, his mind already mapping out the potential movements and threats. He wasn't angry. Anger clouded judgment. What he felt was something else entirely, a simmering resolve, tempered by years of experience. They had made their move, and now it was his turn. The heat seemed to thicken the tension as Kane finally opened the door of his SUV. The movement was unhurried, almost languid, but it carried a certain weight that was impossible to ignore. The sound of the door shutting behind him, a sharp and deliberate thud, echoed across the stalled intersection. For a moment, even the bikers seemed unsure of what to make of him. Here was this man, older than their parents perhaps, dressed simply in jeans and a worn leather jacket, stepping out of his vehicle as though he had all the time in the world. But it wasn't his appearance that made them pause. It was the way he carried himself, calm and unshaken, his presence commanding without effort. Reaper was the first to break the silence. He let out a sharp, mocking laugh, gesturing to the others as if to say, "Can you believe this guy? Well, look who finally decided to come out and play," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You've got guts, old man. I'll give you that." Kane didn't answer. Instead, he took a moment to survey the group, his head turning slightly as his eyes moved from one biker to the next. There were 5 of them, each one dressed in some variation of leather and denim, their bikes parked in a loose semicircle around his SUV. His gaze lingered on Reaper for an extra second, taking in the mirrored sunglasses, the smug grin, the way he leaned on his bike like he owned the world. The others followed his lead, laughing and egging each other on, but none of them had quite the same air of authority. Kane filed that detail away, just as he noted the chain wrapped around one biker's hand, and the knife, sheath barely visible on another's belt. Reaper stepped closer, his boots crunching on the asphalt. "You know what your problem is, old man," he said, jabbing a finger in Kane's direction. "You don't know when to stay in your lane. Now, if you just hand over some cash, or, I don't know, beg a little, maybe we'll let you drive off without any more dents in that piece of junk." The bikers erupted in laughter, their voices blending into a cacophony that grated on the ears. Kane remained motionless, his face impassive, but those who were paying attention, and there were a few in the crowd of onlookers who couldn't tear their eyes away, might have noticed the slight tightening of his jaw, the subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't afraid. He was preparing. When Kane finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to command attention. "You're in my way," he said simply. The words hung in the air, understated yet loaded with meaning. Reaper tilted his head, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What was that?" he asked, his grin faltering for just a second before returning, wider and more forced than before. "You think you can tell us what to do?" Without warning, Reaper lunged forward, shoving Kane with both hands. Or at least, he tried to. Kane shifted his weight at the last second, stepping to the side with a grace that seemed almost unnatural for a man his age. Reaper stumbled, his balance momentarily thrown off, and Kane used that split second to act. His hand shot out, grabbing Reaper's wrist in an iron grip, and before anyone could process what was happening, he twisted and pulled. Reaper let out a strangled yell as he was flipped onto the ground, landing hard on his back with a thud that sent a jolt through the pavement. The crowd gasped. The bikers froze. For the first time, the brash confidence that had defined their every move faltered, replaced by something that looked uncomfortably close to doubt. Reaper groaned, rolling onto his side, his sunglasses askew. "What the hell?" he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of pain and disbelief. He scrambled to his feet, his face red with anger and humiliation. "You think you can just—" Kane didn't give him the chance to finish. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them in 2 strides, and leveled him with a glare that could have frozen steel. "Sit down," Kane said, his voice sharp and cutting, the tone of a man who was used to giving orders and having them followed without question. Reaper hesitated, his bravado wavering. But one of the other bikers, the wiry one with the chain, decided to step in. "You can't talk to him like that," he shouted, swinging the chain in a wide arc as he charged toward Kane. Kane moved faster than anyone expected. He sidestepped the attack, grabbing the biker's wrist mid-swing and using his momentum against him. The chain clattered to the ground as the biker was spun around and shoved forward, stumbling into another member of the gang. Both of them went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. The remaining bikers, now visibly shaken, exchanged uncertain glances. They had come into this expecting an easy target, a bit of fun at some old man's expense. Instead, they were watching their leader and their friends get taken apart with surgical precision. One of them, the youngest looking of the group, pulled out a knife, the blade catching the light as he flicked it open. "You're dead, old man," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to muster the courage to attack. Cain didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried, and fixed the young man with a cold stare. "Put it down," he said, his tone brooking no argument. For a moment, it seemed like the biker might comply. His grip on the knife wavered, his arm trembling slightly. But then Reaper, still nursing his bruised pride, barked out, "Do it! Take him down!" Spurred on by the command, the young biker lunged. Cain caught his wrist mid-strike, twisting it in a way that forced the knife to clatter to the ground. A quick sweep of Cain's leg sent the biker sprawling, his momentum carrying him onto his back. Before he could get up, Cain placed a boot on his chest, pinning him in place. "Stay down," Cain said, his voice calm but unyielding. The remaining bikers were frozen in place, their bravado completely shattered. Reaper, still standing but visibly shaken, took a step back, his eyes darting toward his bike as though considering a retreat. Cain straightened, letting his gaze sweep over the group once more. "Anyone else?" he asked, his tone even, almost conversational. The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. No one moved. The bikers, who had moments ago been full of swagger and confidence, now looked like schoolyard bullies caught in the act. The crowd, which had grown in size, watched in stunned silence, their phones capturing every second of the confrontation. Satisfied that the message had been received, Cain stepped back, releasing the young biker and allowing him to scramble to his feet. He turned to Reaper, who was still standing a few feet away, his fists clenched but his eyes filled with uncertainty. "This is your one chance," Cain said, his voice quiet but carrying all the authority of a man who had spent his life commanding soldiers. "Walk away." Now, for a long moment, no one moved. Then slowly, Reaper nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice barely audible. The bikers began to retreat, their movements slow and subdued, their earlier arrogance completely gone. Cain watched them go, his expression unreadable, before turning back toward his SUV. The crowd erupted into applause as he opened the door and slid back into the driver's seat. Cain didn't acknowledge them. He adjusted his mirror, took a deep breath, and prepared to move on, as though nothing had happened at all. The bikers hadn't gone far. They lingered just outside the range of direct confrontation, regrouping around their motorcycles, muttering among themselves. Their bravado was bruised, but the sting of humiliation ran deeper. Reaper, still visibly seething, paced like a caged animal. His sunglasses were gone, revealing eyes filled with frustration and disbelief. The other bikers watched him warily, unsure of their next move, but unwilling to voice their doubts. Cain, meanwhile, remained calm, his every move deliberate and measured, as though he had calculated every possible outcome and was prepared for each one. The crowd around the intersection had thickened, cars idling as their occupants leaned out of windows to watch the unfolding drama. Cain was aware of them, the weight of their eyes on him, but he didn't acknowledge the attention. His focus was entirely on the bikers. He could see the gears turning in their minds, the way their anger and embarrassment vied with their instinct for self-preservation.
They hadn't decided yet whether to leave or escalate. Cain decided to make the choice easier for them. He took a step forward, his boots striking the pavement with quiet authority. The sound wasn't loud, but in the charged silence it carried. The bikers stopped muttering, their heads snapping toward him as though drawn by an invisible force. Reaper's pacing halted, his fists clenching at his sides. Cain's gaze swept over them, not with the contempt or fury they might have expected, but with something colder, sharper. He wasn't looking at them as people, he was assessing them as threats. "You've had your fun," Kane said, his voice low but firm, cutting through the tension like a blade. Now it's time to leave. Reaper barked out a laugh, though it lacked the confidence it had held earlier. You don't get to tell us what to do, he said, his tone forced, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as the others. He gestured to his crew. You think you're some kind of tough guy, because you got lucky? You've got no idea who you're messing with. Kane's expression didn't change. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't even blink. He simply stood there, his presence filling the space between them. It wasn't just his size or his posture. It was the way he carried himself, the quiet confidence of someone who had faced far worse than a gang of bikers and walked away unscathed. That kind of presence couldn't be faked. It wasn't bravado or arrogance. It was earned, forged through years of experience and tempered by challenges that most people couldn't imagine. You're right, Kane said evenly, his tone conversational but laced with a steely undercurrent. You have no idea who I am, and that should scare you. The simple statement hit harder than any shouted threat could have. Reaper's grin faltered, his bravado cracking just enough for Kane to see the fear underneath. But fear could be dangerous, Kane knew. It made people desperate, unpredictable. He had to control the situation before it spiraled any further. One of the younger bikers, the one who had pulled a knife earlier, took a hesitant step forward. His hands were empty now, but his posture was stiff, his movements jerky. We're not scared of you, he said, though his voice wavered slightly. You're just some old guy who got lucky. Kane tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto the younger man. Luck has nothing to do with it, he said. But keep pushing, and you'll find out what does. The younger biker hesitated, glancing back at Reaper as though looking for guidance. Reaper, however, was staring at Kane, his jaw tight, his fists still clenched. He seemed to be weighing his options, torn between his wounded pride and the nagging realization that he was outmatched. You think you're some kind of hero? Reaper finally said, his voice louder now, almost desperate. You think you can just walk out here and embarrass us in front of all these people? Kane didn't answer right away. Instead, he took another step forward, closing the distance between them. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step calculated to draw the attention of not just Reaper, but the entire group. When he stopped, he was standing directly in front of the gang's leader, close enough that Reaper had to tilt his head back slightly to meet his gaze. Kane didn't need to say anything. His silence was enough to fill the air with an almost unbearable tension. You embarrassed yourself, Kane said finally, his voice quiet but firm. You came here looking for a fight, thinking you could bully someone weaker than you. That's not strength. That's cowardice. Reaper's face turned red, his lips curling into a snarl. You don't know anything about us, he spat. You think you're better than us? Kane's gaze didn't waver. No, he said, but I know what real strength looks like. And it's not this. The words hit harder than any punch could have. Reaper flinched, his bravado crumbling as he took an involuntary step back. The other bikers watched, their expressions a mixture of confusion and unease. They had followed Reaper because he was loud, confident, and unafraid to take risks. But now, in the face of Kane's unshakable presence, that confidence was unraveling, and with it, their faith in their leader. You have two choices, Kane continued, addressing the group as a whole now. You can walk away, or you can stay and learn what happens when you pick the wrong fight. But make no mistake, if you choose the second option, you won't like how it ends. The bikers exchanged glances, their earlier bravado replaced by uncertainty. Even the younger ones, who had been so eager to prove themselves earlier, seemed reluctant to meet Kane's gaze. Reaper, however, wasn't ready to back down. His pride wouldn't let him. He squared his shoulders, his fists clenching even tighter. You think you're untouchable? Reaper said, his voice rising. You think you can just stand there and talk to us like that? Kane didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. I'm not untouchable, he said calmly. But I am prepared. Are you? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Reaper hesitated, his mouth opening as though to retort, but no words came out. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional murmur from the crowd of onlookers. Finally, Reaper let out a frustrated growl, turning away and kicking at the ground. "Let's get out of here," he muttered, his voice low but audible enough for the others to hear. The bikers hesitated, glancing at each other, but none of them argued. One by one, they climbed back onto their bikes, their movements slow and subdued. Reaper mounted his bike last, sparing one final glare in Kane's direction. "This isn't over," he said, though the words lacked conviction. Kane didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching as the bikers revved their engines and began to pull away. The crowd parted to let them through, the onlookers whispering among themselves as they watched the gang retreat. Once the bikers were gone, the tension in the air seemed to dissipate, replaced by a sense of relief. Kane turned back toward his SUV, his expression unreadable. The crowd began to disperse, some clapping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Kane ignored them all, opening the door and sliding back into the driver's seat. He adjusted his mirror, took a deep breath, and started the engine. The applause from the remaining onlookers followed him as he pulled away, but he didn't look back. The bikers were gone, but the lesson he had delivered would linger, etched into their memories as a reminder of the consequences of underestimating the wrong man. As Kane drove a few blocks from the scene, his senses remained sharp, his instincts refusing to relax despite the apparent resolution. The bikers might have retreated, but Kane knew men like Reaper. Wounded pride and public humiliation didn't sit well with their type. Sure enough, in his rearview mirror, he caught the distant glint of headlights weaving through traffic, too erratic and deliberate to belong to anyone else. They were following him. Kane sighed softly, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. He wasn't surprised, but he was disappointed. He'd given them every opportunity to walk away with their dignity intact. Now, they were forcing his hand.
He shifted lanes, turning onto a quieter road, away from the busy intersection and the onlookers who had scattered after the initial confrontation. If they wanted a fight, they wouldn't get it on crowded streets where others could get hurt. The road narrowed, flanked by warehouses and abandoned lots. It was quiet here, the streetlights dim and far apart, casting long, flickering shadows. Kane pulled his SUV to a slow stop, killing the engine and stepping out. The bikers roared up moments later, their engines breaking the stillness like a pack of wolves howling into the night. Reaper was at the front, his face twisted with rage. The humiliation of their earlier defeat still raw. "You think you can humiliate us and just drive away?" Reaper shouted, dismounting his bike. His voice was louder now, filled with venom, but it carried a thread of desperation. He wasn't just angry. He was trying to prove something to himself and to his crew. The others followed his lead, their earlier hesitation replaced by a dangerous determination. They weren't laughing anymore. There was no pretense of mockery or bravado. This wasn't about games or intimidation. It was personal now. Kane stood in the middle of the road, his posture relaxed, his hands at his sides. He didn't bother responding to Reaper's taunts. Instead, his eyes moved over the group, assessing their weapons and body language. Reaper had a crowbar in hand, its metal glinting under the faint streetlights. Another biker, the wiry one who'd wielded the chain earlier, now held it tightly, the links coiled around his fist like a serpent ready to strike. The younger one, who'd brandished the night before, had it out again, the blade trembling slightly in his hand. The other two seemed less equipped but no less determined. "I told you to walk away," Kane said finally, his voice calm, almost conversational. "You're not ready for this. None of you are." "Shut up," Reaper snarled, his face twisting with fury. He took a step forward, swinging the crowbar through the air in a menacing arc. "You don't get to talk anymore. Not after what you did." Kane's expression didn't change. He watched Reaper's approach, his body poised and still, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. "You're about to make a mistake you can't take back," he warned. But Reaper wasn't listening. He charged, the crowbar raised high. Kane moved, fast and precise, stepping into the swing rather than away from it. His arm shot up, his hand catching Reaper's wrist mid-swing. With a sharp twist and a step to the side, he used Reaper's momentum against him. pulling him off balance and sending him sprawling to the ground. The crowbar clattered onto the pavement, the sound sharp and final. The others hesitated, their confidence faltering as their leader hit the ground. But the wiry biker with the chain snarled and stepped forward, swinging the heavy links in a wide, looping arc. Kane ducked under the first swing, his movements fluid, and stepped into the biker's space before he could recover. He grabbed the chain mid-swing, yanking it hard and pulling the man off balance. A sharp jab to the solar plexus sent the biker crumpling to his knees, gasping for air. The younger biker, emboldened by adrenaline and desperation, lunged with his knife. Kane sidestepped the attack, grabbing the boy's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the ground. He didn't strike the kid. Instead, he held him there for a moment, his grip firm but not cruel. "Go home," Kane said, his voice quiet but commanding. "This isn't your fight." The kid hesitated, his eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Kane released him with a slight shove, sending him stumbling back. The boy looked around, his gaze darting between Kane and his fallen comrades, before taking a few hesitant steps backward. Finally, he turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows. That left two. One of them, a burly man with a shaved head, charged without a weapon, his fists raised. Kane stepped aside at the last moment, his elbows snapping out to catch the man in the ribs as he passed. The biker grunted in pain, stumbling but remaining upright. Kane didn't give him a chance to recover. A quick sweep of the legs sent him crashing to the ground, groaning. Reaper was back on his feet now, his face contorted with rage. He lunged for the crowbar, grabbing it off the ground and swinging wildly. This time, his attacks were reckless, fueled by anger rather than strategy. Kane moved with precision, dodging each swing with practiced ease. When the opportunity presented itself, he stepped in close, his arm snapping out to deliver a sharp, controlled strike to Reaper's forearm. The crowbar fell from his grip once more, clattering onto the pavement. Breathing heavily, Reaper stumbled back, cradling his arm. His crew was in disarray, most of them on the ground, groaning or too shaken to continue. The fight was over and they all knew it. Kane stood in the center of the chaos, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp, scanning for any lingering threats. Reaper's chest heaved as he glared at Kane, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice shaking. "You don't know who you're messing with." Kane stepped closer, his gaze locked onto Reaper's. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with," he said. "A scared little boy trying to prove something. But all you've proven is that you don't know when to quit." The words hit harder than any physical blow. Reaper's shoulders sagged, his defiance crumbling under the weight of Kane's unyielding presence. He looked around at his fallen crew, at the wreckage of their failed retaliation, and finally seemed to realize the futility of continuing. "This isn't over," Reaper muttered, his voice barely audible. "It is," Kane said firmly. "Walk away while you still can." Reaper hesitated, his jaw clenching as he fought the urge to argue. But in the end, he turned and stumbled toward his bike, his movements stiff and reluctant. The others followed, dragging themselves to their feet and limping toward their rides. One by one, they mounted their motorcycles and rode off into the night, their engines fading into the distance. Kane stood there for a moment, watching them go. The night was quiet again, the street empty except for him and the scattered remnants of the confrontation. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders to release the tension that had built up during the fight. Sliding back into his SUV, Kane started the engine and pulled back onto the road. The fight was over, but the lesson he had delivered would linger long after the bruises faded. Strength, Kane knew, wasn't about dominance or intimidation. It was about knowing when to act and when to hold back, when to fight and when to walk away. Tonight, he had shown them what real strength looked like. Whether they learned from it was up to them. The road ahead stretched out quiet and empty under the dim glow of streetlights. Kane drove with the same calm precision that had carried him through years of battlefields and command posts. His grip on the wheel was steady, his breathing even, but his mind worked silently, processing the events that had unfolded. The confrontation had been necessary. He was sure of that, But there was a weight to it, a lingering heaviness that came with exerting force when no better option remained. He wasn't a man prone to introspection, but as the city gave way to quieter streets, Kane allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. The bikers were young, impulsive, and reckless, traits that made them dangerous in the wrong hands. But they weren't hardened criminals. Not yet. He had seen flashes of hesitation in their eyes, cracks in their bravado. Those cracks were what concerned him. Desperation and humiliation could be volatile, leading to escalation rather than reflection. He had offered them an out. Whether they took it would determine their next path. The city lights faded behind him as he neared the edge of town. The streets quieter here, lined with small houses and darkened shops. Kane's destination wasn't far now. A quiet diner where an old friend was waiting for him. He'd planned this evening for weeks, looking forward to reconnecting over stories and laughter. But now, as he turned into the parking lot, he felt a pang of unease. It wasn't the bikers. They were gone, their retreat undeniable. It was something else, a faint but persistent feeling that the night's events weren't quite over. He parked his SUV and stepped out, stretching his shoulders as he glanced around. The diner's neon sign buzzed softly in the otherwise silent night, its light reflecting off the polished chrome of a few parked cars. Inside, the warm glow of fluorescent lighting revealed scattered patrons. A trucker nursing a cup of coffee, a young couple sharing a plate of fries. Kane's eyes settled on a familiar face at the back corner booth. "Late as always," said Tom Harding, a fellow retired officer and one of Kane's oldest friends. His grin was wide, his eyes crinkling at the edges with the kind of warmth that only years of camaraderie could foster. "Traffic," Kane replied simply, sliding into the booth across from him. He didn't elaborate, and Tom didn't press. Kane had always been a man of few words, and Tom respected that. They exchanged pleasantries, the conversation flowing easily into memories of shared deployments and old colleagues. For a while, Kane allowed himself to relax, the tension from earlier fading into the background as they laughed over stories of stubborn recruits and impossible missions. The waitress, a young woman with a kind smile, brought their meals, simple, hearty diner fare that reminded Kane of days long past. But as they ate, Kane couldn't shake the feeling that lingered in the back of his mind. It was a habit born from years of vigilance, a refusal to ignore his instincts. He glanced out the window occasionally, his eyes scanning the street for anything out of place. Tom noticed, setting down his fork with a knowing look. "Something happened on the way here?" Tom asked. Kane hesitated, then nodded. "A run-in with some bikers. They were looking for trouble." Tom raised an eyebrow. "And I'm guessing they found it." "They did." Kane's tone was matter-of-fact, but Tom knew him well enough to hear the weight beneath the words. "I gave them a chance to walk away. They didn't take it." Tom leaned back, crossing his arms. "And now you're wondering if they'll come back." Kane shrugged slightly, neither confirming nor denying it. His focus returned to the window, his gaze sweeping over the quiet street. The bikers were unlikely to return tonight, but he wasn't one to take chances. Tom followed his gaze, his expression thoughtful. "You did what you had to," Tom said after a moment. "Some people only learn the hard way." Kane nodded but didn't respond. The waitress came by to refill their coffee, her presence briefly breaking the tension. Kane offered her a polite thank you before returning his attention to Tom. "They weren't hardened," Kane said finally. "Not yet, but they were on the edge. Pushing them further might have made things worse." Tom considered this, nodding slowly. "Maybe, but sometimes it takes a hard shove to wake people up." The conversation drifted after that, returning to lighter topics. But when Kane stepped back into the cool night air after saying his goodbyes, the feeling of unease returned. He paused by his SUV, his eyes scanning the empty street. He wasn't looking for the bikers specifically. It was something broader, a habit of checking his surroundings that had been ingrained in him through years of training. The sound of an approaching engine broke the silence. Faint at first but growing louder. Kane turned, his posture relaxing slightly, when he recognized the motorcycle. It was the younger biker, the one who had hesitated earlier, now riding alone. The bike slowed as it approached, coming to a stop a few yards from Kane. The rider dismounted, removing his helmet to reveal a face that looked even younger than Kane had guessed. "Hey!" the boy said, his voice cautious but not hostile. Kane didn't reply immediately, his eyes narrowing slightly as he assessed the situation. The boy raised his hands, palms out, a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to start anything," he said quickly. I wanted to say thanks." Kane tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "For what?" The boy hesitated, glancing down at the pavement. "For not hurting me," he said finally. "For giving me a chance to walk away." Kane studied him for a moment, then nodded. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone neutral. I don't know," the boy admitted. "I guess I just wanted to let you know I get it. What you said earlier about strength. You're right, Reaper. He's not what I thought he was. None of them are." The boy's voice wavered, a mix of frustration and shame. Kane's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained firm. "What are you going to do about it?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. The boy shifted uncomfortably, his hands fidgeting at his sides. "I don't know," he said again, his voice quieter this time. "But I don't want to end up like them." Kane nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "Then don't," he said simply. "Make a different choice?" The boy looked up, meeting Kane's eyes for the first time. There was something in his expression, a glimmer of determination, faint but real. He nodded, slipping his helmet back on. "Thanks," he said, his voice muffled now. As the boy rode off into the night, Kane watched him go, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He climbed into his SUV and started the engine, the hum of the motor breaking the stillness. As he pulled onto the road, the unease that had followed him all night began to fade. He didn't know if the boy would follow through, but he had planted a seed, and sometimes that was enough. Kane drove on, the city lights fading behind him, leaving only the quiet road and the endless horizon ahead. The following week unfolded quietly for Kane, much like his usual days since retirement. The confrontation with the bikers had been relegated to a corner of his mind, a resolved chapter he didn't dwell on but wouldn't forget. He spent his mornings sipping coffee on the porch of his modest home, the sun warming the creaking wood beneath his chair. His days were filled with simple tasks, errands, light reading, and the occasional phone call from old friends. Life was steady, just the way he preferred it. One evening, as the sky deepened to an orange hue, Kane sat with a book in hand, the piece of twilight wrapping around him. The sound of a motorcycle engine in the distance broke the stillness, growing louder as it approached. His eyes flicked toward the street. A single bike appeared, slowing as it neared his driveway. Kane placed the book down and stood, his hand resting lightly on the porch railing. The young biker, the same one who had approached him outside the diner, dismounted and removed his helmet. His demeanor was different this time, less hesitant, more deliberate. Kane could see it in his posture, the way he held himself. The boy walked up the driveway, stopping a respectful distance away. "I didn't know where else to go," the boy said, his voice steady but carrying an undertone of uncertainty. "I'm not with them anymore." Kane leaned against the railing, crossing his arms. He studied the boys silently for a moment, noting the changes since their last encounter. The bravado and recklessness were gone, replaced by something quieter, more introspective. "What happened?" Kane asked, his voice calm. The boy hesitated, shifting on his feet. "Reaper's gone off the rails," he admitted. "After what happened with you, he's been trying to prove something, pushing the crew into more dangerous stuff. I didn't want any part of it, so I left." Kane nodded, his expression unreadable. "That takes guts," he said finally, "walking away from people like that." The boy looked down, his shoulders tense. "I don't feel brave. I feel lost. I don't know what to do next." Kane stepped off the porch, closing the distance between them. "You already did the hardest part," he said. "You made a choice. Now you figure out what kind of man you want to be." The boy glanced up, his eyes searching Kane's face for answers. "How?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kane's gaze softened, and he gestured toward the bike. "Start with something simple," he said. "That bike doesn't have to be a symbol of trouble. It can be a tool, a means to something better. What else are you good at?" The boy shrugged. "Not much. I dropped out of school. Never stuck with anything." "Then now's the time to change that," Kane said. "Go back. Find a trade. Learn something you can build on. It's not about where you've been. It's about where you're going." The boy seemed to take the words to heart, his expression shifting as though a weight had lifted. "You really think I can do that?" he asked. Kane nodded. "You've already taken the first step. The rest is just work." The boy stood there for a moment longer, then straightened his shoulders. "Thanks," he said, his voice steadier now. "For everything?" Kane gave him a small nod. "Take care of yourself," he said. The boy donned his helmet, mounted the bike, and rode off into the fading light. Kane watched until the sound of the engine disappeared, leaving only the soft rustle of the evening breeze. He returned to his porch, the quiet once again enveloping him. This time, though, it felt different, more resolute, more settled. A week later, Kane received an envelope in the mail. The handwriting on it was unfamiliar, but something about it piqued his curiosity. Inside was a letter from the boy. It was short and to the point, but the words carried weight. Asterisk, "I took your advice. Enrolled in a mechanics program at the trade school downtown. Feels good to have a plan for once. Wanted to let you know you were right. About making a choice, about doing the work. Thanks again. I owe you one." Asterisk, there was no signature, but Kane didn't need one. He folded the letter and placed it on his desk, a small smile tugging at his lips. It wasn't the first time he guided someone toward a better path, but it reminded him of why he still felt the pull to intervene when it mattered. As for the bikers, Kane heard rumors here and there. Reaper had apparently pushed the gang too far, alienating even his most loyal followers. Some said he left town, taking his bruised pride with him. Others whispered that he'd gotten into trouble with the wrong people, his bravado finally catching up to him. Kane didn't dwell on it. He had done his part, and that was enough. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Kane was in town running errands when he spotted a familiar figure at a garage near the edge of town. The boy, no, not a boy anymore, was working on a motorcycle, his hands covered in grease, his expression focused. Kane parked his SUV and stepped out, watching for a moment before the young man noticed him. A grin broke across the mechanic's face. "Hey, Kane," he said, standing and wiping his hands on a rag. "Didn't think I'd see you here. Just passing by." Kane replied, "Looks like you're doing well." The young man nodded, gesturing to the bike he was working on. "Got a job here a couple months ago. The trade school helped me land it. Feels good, you know? Doing something real." Kane nodded, a small smile forming. "Keep at it," he said. "You've earned it." As they parted ways, Kane felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The road ahead wasn't just his anymore. Somewhere along the way, he had helped another find their own path. Life, Kane knew, wasn't about monumental changes or dramatic gestures. It was about the quiet moments, the simple choices that set someone on a better course. And in those moments, he found peace. Driving home, the horizon stretched wide before him, golden in the light of the setting sun. The quiet road felt less solitary, more like a shared journey. Kane wasn't just a man who had fought battles. He was a man who had helped others avoid them. And as the miles disappeared beneath his tires, he knew that was a legacy worth leaving behind.